Thank you so much for joining us today. It's a great pleasure and honor to welcome Laliv Melamed in today's lecture series. I don't need to really introduce you to Laliv since she is one of our superstars at ConTrust, at our formerly postdoc at ConTrust, but what I've heard, you're moving on already, congrats on that. So to give you a short intro, Laliv is or was a research fellow postdoc at the, how's it called, research program Configurations of Film, Konfigurationen des Films, here at Goethe University. She has published extensively in really well-established journals like the Journal of International Politics or the Anthropology Review. Her dissertation won or was awarded the Society for Cinema Studies Dissertation Award. Maybe you should find a more comprehensive title there, but so that is really an excellent award that you were getting, and we're really glad to have you today in our lecture series to introduce maybe a different approach to algorithms. So I must confess that as lawyers, and Indra is now joining us as well, we have normally pretty pre-configured approaches, especially text-based approaches to questions of algorithms, of power diffusion, and the such, and democracy, of course. And so I'm really looking forward to your presentation today, which I presume will give us at least a multimodal or at least a different perspective on how to look onto these subject matters. So Laliv, I'm very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks. I'll just quickly share my screen. Okay. So hello and good evening, everyone. I want to first thank Christoph and Indra for inviting me to present my work in this important and timely series. I need to admit that I'm too a bit out of my comfort zones, since algorithm, or more specifically to my case, artificial intelligence, are not the core of my research, but more of an ongoing footnote. And also because I am speaking from a position of media studies scholar, and I'm going to explain about it in a minute. So I want to start my talk by contextualizing my approach. As Christoph mentioned, I am a film and media scholar, and I specialized in documentary and nonfiction. And my interests lie at questions of media and governance in political constellations of a violent conflict. More specifically, I'm concerned with the state of exception and the militarization of perception and public discourse in Israel-Palestine. The study I will present today is a work in progress. It's something relatively new. And it's part of a project on the operative image, a paradigm within film and media studies that conveys the executive power of images, or the ability of images and image-based mechanism to be free agents that act. As I would later argue, this paradigm becomes ever more pertinent in an algorithmic era. So the paradigm of the operative image brings to the fore a number of inquiries or prisms. First, there is the technological prism. So we can ask, what are the technological affordances and protocols that allow images to act? Then there is the ethical and juridical prism. So we can ask, do we want to allow images and image mechanisms to act just like that on their own? And then third, which is more where my interests lie, there is the question how this paradigm affects our political imagination and political epistemologies. So here we can ask how these images function as a form of knowledge about particular state-sanctioned actions. In my talk today, I will do the following. I will start by, first of all, making the case that artificial intelligence, that I will refer to from now on as AI technology, enters and transforms contemporary warfare. Second, I will argue that with this new technological logic, the analytical paradigm of the operative image becomes ever more relevant. While the operative image indicates the automation of protocols of action, I would like to show how, and this would be my third section, AI mandate of action is actually predicated on a preliminary and also retroactive phases of representation. And here I think that film and media knowledge can particularly contribute to the discussion. Lastly, and this is something I will do very briefly, I will conclude by pointing at some of the pertinent lines of investigation related to the epistemic resonance of operative images that I locate in questions of secrecy and transparency. So let us begin. AI warfare. In January this year, The New Yorker published an article titled "The Rise of AI Fighter Pilots." The article follows a project run by DAPRA, the US Defense Department Research Agency, which aim is to develop a plane that can fly and engage in aerial combat without a human pilot flying it. And wait, let me turn off the volume so I can speak to you while this is running in the background. So this is a demonstration of how the AI actually works. The project is part of a program called ACE, an abbreviation of Air Combat Evolution, that integrates AI into air combat, or what is termed dogfighting. This move is part of a larger and ongoing transition in the military in which new technologies that are based on algorithm and artificial intelligence are integrated into military conduct, from logistics to intelligence to combat. The article delineates a complex that draws on the private sector, so the tech industry, civil society, academia, and military. This process involves programmers, aviation experts, military strategists, sociologists, and psychologists. It walks the reader through the process of training AI, a process predicated on numerous simulations that teach AI to follow a variety of pre-established scenarios. The program does not aim to substitute human pilots altogether, but rather to create a hybrid of AI and human fighting, leading eventually, as one of the project leaders that is cited in the article said, decompose our forces. And I think this is a really interesting language, to decompose the forces. Beyond providing an insight into the military's effort to adjust to an algorithmic era, there are a number of things to highlight from the article. First, the envisioning of a warfare AI as concurring or occurring in hybridity with human actors. Second, the long and laborious experimental and imperfect process of training combat AI. And lastly, the need to establish trust between human agents and programmed ones. The Israeli Defense Force and Israeli national security industry, which is more my sphere of expertise, so in this complex, the rhetoric of novelty predicated on high-tech solutions and including algorithmic design and AI has long been the forefront of military conduct, or a statement on the military futurity. In Israel, the military tech industry complex can be described as tight, symbiotic, and mutually benefiting. So in this slide, we see it's basically a recruitment ad for the Israeli Secret Service that called for programmers. And it's really interesting to see how it kind of like show how vast and varied this occupational field is under the military industry. This is also an ad for Cybercam, for pre-military service adolescents. So there is also the idea that there is this kind of like pedagogic channeling of youth to a path that start with pre-military and then like a sort of a high-tech military career that then leads to integration in the Israeli high-tech industry. The military has long been a haven of tech experimentation, development, and integration, and even more so in time of expeditious technological development. And this isn't true not only to Israel. But being a high-tech nation, where the military is also a preceding and almost integral part of civil infrastructures, these connections, at least in the Israeli case, are even stronger. This also can play, I think. No, sorry. Okay. The IDF actually started also already integrating AI systems into its operation for quite a while. AI is involved in operations of mapping, intelligence, and even surgical elimination. So here what we see is a snake robot allegedly designed to be used in what is called the Gaza Metro. So a chain of underground tunnels are under the occupied and sieged city of Gaza that the Israelis deemed as one of its greatest security risks. So there is a lot of conversation of what is called tunnel warfare in Israel, and you see that these conversations have this rhetoric of tech novelty and new technological development, and the snake, which is based on this kind of like optic fabric technology, is also equipped with the ability to map but also eliminate based on artificial intelligence. Another thing that I discovered, and it was really interesting for me, so when I was doing research for this talk, I was interested in a new collaboration launched between the national security industry company Rafael and one of the leading imaging technologies companies, AnyVision, a collaboration that, according to the information I found, led to the establishment of a new company called Sitex. That is supposed to work with new vision technologies based on AI for different combative purposes. And this is what I found on their website. Saving lives with artificial intelligence systems. Well, we still can say much about what we do, but we can introduce you to the team that's doing it. And this is something working on secrecy, something that was really interesting for me, this gesture of we know what we're doing, and we have experts to do it, but we can't tell you. So this gesture of there is knowledge that is not just the processes or coding are obscured, but also the knowledge itself or the purpose itself is obscured. And hopefully I'll have some time to say more about it toward the end of my talk. Let me see if I can play this video for you. Here. The science and technology. The science and technology scholar Lucy Sushman studies algorithmic warfare technology. Sushman criticizes the danger of integrating such technologies by probing the concept of accuracy. Her critique I find extremely important for us, especially the way she articulates the ethical problems algorithmic warfare entails. Researching the US Department of Defense project MAVEN, a project launched in 2017 with the aim to integrate algorithmic warfare into the US military and more specifically into operations of targeted killing. Sushman challenges the project premises by pausing on the process of training AI through classification. And what we see here is actually a video work by artist Haroon Farouki that actually shows a program that trains soldiers into recognizing an enemy or danger. But it's interesting how it resonates with AI training. The algorithmic needs to learn how to identify concepts such as danger, terrorist, or enemy. And all these are extremely constructed categories that rose on socially determined system of signification, namely semiotics. Such classification is difficult to determine since, as one of the project architects attests, something like terrorism is not a norm, but rather an exception, an irregular scenario. And the training of AI is predicated on repetitive scenarios. So it was very hard for the US military to actually train algorithms to recognize a terrorist or terrorism. In addition, as Sushman herself notes, America's infamous war on terror, was deeply invested in what is called the fog of war, meaning speculative warfare, and not clear-cut definitions, such as the one demanded here when trying to train AI. So to summarize this section before I move to the next one, I try to show here a number of key aspects related to the emergence of algorithmic warfare or AI warfare. First, its reliance on military, industry, civil society complex, and it's drawing on discourses of novelty and innovation. This is very much the outfacing rhetoric of such effort, or rather its PR work, the way it is being represented to the public. Second, the importance of simulation and scenarios. Third, the AI-human hybridity. And finally, the predication of AI in socially determined symbiotic categories. And now I'll move to the second section, the operative image. The operative image, as I proposed in my short introduction, is an image that operates. It is a means to an end where action, mostly mechanical, is already contained within the visible. And the process of collecting data, analyzing it, considering ways of action, and then acting upon it are condensed and corroborated in the optics themselves. An operative image is an image applied with operative logic, making it instantly analyzable. The most prominent, albeit preliminary, reference to the operative paradigm is offered by German filmmaker and theoretician Harun Faruqi, whose work we just saw, in a text that was published in 2003. Faruqi defines the operative image, and I quote, as pictures made neither to entertain nor to inform. Operative images. These are images that do not represent an object, but rather are part of an operation, end of quote. Faruqi, who in the majority of his long-term career was mostly interested in the abstraction of labor in contemporary consumerist cultures, was working at the time that he wrote this article on military technologies. His text is based on an analysis of images of television-directed missiles, or what we come to have known as smart bombs, that was first introduced, at least to the public eye, I think it was in the first Gulf War, so early 90s. In brackets, it's just important for me to note that well, there is a varied terminology through which one can address the kind of images and operations I'm talking to you about today, such as warfare media, or then algorithmic media, and so on and so forth. I was particularly interested in the paradigm of the operative image because I was interested in showing how they're like conveying or how they're also predicated on human-related interactions and investments, namely labor. So there's definitely the idea that operation or operative image is related to how things work and to human labor that I'm interested in this project. I want to pause for a minute on actually the second part of Faruqi's definition of the operative image, so images that are part of an operation. As scholars of nonfiction and industrial cinema have pointed out time and again, from its very invention, there was a varied and dynamic use of cinema outside the realm of theatrical display and entertainment. So the idea that there are images that take part in operations, it's not that new. But while we can say that film was a crucial component in various processes of labor and knowledge production, and here I'm also drawing on the term useful cinema that Heidi Wusson and Charles Ackland, in a book that you see to your right or left, that's how you look at it, investigated. So while there is this ongoing idea that film is usable, I do need to say that in its earlier iterations, or the kind of films that nonfiction and industrial cinema scholars are working on, film was still used as a form of representation. So it was used to propagate, instruct, demonstrate, teach, and it was definitely drawing on its big screen effect. So the idea that there was this playfulness and spectacle that informed what Wasson and Ackland terms youthful cinema. So they look into the use of film in research labs, in workplaces, and I also put this great collection, Films That Work, here as yet another example for the idea that film was a useful tool in processes of labor and knowledge production. Going back to the operative image, Faruqi's notion of operativity draws more on philosopher William Flusser category of the technical image than the idea of usability. Because as I said, this idea of usability is still very much in line with the cinematic tradition. So an image that is actually situated outside certain regimes of representation and attraction, such as the one cinema has to offer. The literary and photography scholar Thomas Keenan draws on Alan Sekula's instrumental image with an important note to Faruqi when he notes that specified modes of interpretation of images, discerning, analyzing, and deliberating, are now supplemental to the technology itself, making the image operative. So the idea that there was these processes that were external to images, that were applied on images, are now already part of the mechanism. And then lastly, the photographer and artist Trevor Paglen draws on the category of the operative image while trying to penetrate a new visual order offered by machine-readable images. And this is an image made by Paglen. So he really works with this technology and tries to think about them as kind of like a parallel visual order, one that we also need to train ourselves into or to learn how to see and how to read. Media scholar Odd Cecil-Hall surveys the current interest in the paradigm of the operative image in the field of media studies from the very open reading produced by cultural studies of operativity as an image that generates actions and effects, to the more techno-determinist approach that is mostly associated with German media studies, but I'm not going to say more on that, that locks operativity within the technical mechanics of media. She concludes by noting that the operative image as a paradigm is brought into the field to negotiate the growing discrepancies between the human and the mechanical, which is parsed by the dichotomy of representation versus action. She also contends that the paradigm of the operative image is most productive to the field if approached not through the binary of action and representation, but through the continuity of these categories. And to summarize this debate and maybe underline what Cecil-Hall is saying, what these readings share is the notion that we're subjected to a new visual regime in which images take prominence in numerous technical processes, are made by machines and for machines, and by that refuse a sort of semiotics, an intelligible gesture towards the human made through representation. Deemed outside representation, image and image-making technologies now partake in processes that are devoid of human agency. These readings echo an anxiety that is not necessarily unjust about operations becoming automated and obscured. In an age of algorithmic programming, tells media scholar Wendy Chun, the codes that run the algorithm become so complex and are designed to be sort of self-generated that even programmers themselves can't read it. Even programmers are losing access or cannot read, or the code is not representable for them as well. So representation emerged here as a sort of human gatekeeping or liability. Imaging technologies are the subject of study, analysis, and debate across many fields: critical geography, peace and conflict studies, international law, sociology, anthropology, to name just a few. In addition to media studies, my own research draws on political and juridical philosophy, as well as critical security studies and science, technology, and society studies. But as a film and media studies scholar, I would like to focus and articulate precisely those aspects related to representation. Those aspects related to representation, I believe, are key for understanding what is the image and what are its operations. Which bring me to the last, the one before last part: simulation, hybridity, and speculation equal representation. So in this section, I would like to argue that first, trained through repetitive scenarios, operative images, including artificial intelligence, always have a simulated model as a preliminary stage. Second, that AI doesn't assume purely automated mode of being, but rather a human-machine hybrid. And third, that classification, a necessary element of artificial intelligence, is predicated on semiotics and feeds a speculative operation. The speculative operation has representation as both its preliminary stage and afterthought. So when I started working on the operative image, I realized that I need to first understand how does it work. Operation as a term implies atomized spheres of knowledge and doing that I didn't necessarily have access to. So with a group of PhD students from the university, I started visiting what we termed sites of visual episteme. So places where visual knowledge of a particular kind is produced and feeds these sites' operations. So for instance, the meteorological station, we went to a physics lab that worked with high-speed photography and so on and so forth. One thing that drew my attention was that every operation in these sites of operations started with a simulated model. We see this also with the ACE training and of an AI fighter pilot. Algorithm that informs AI necessitates scenarios as much as it also creates them. In the case of AI, these scenarios are coded, but simulation, 3D models, and scenarios that I encountered everywhere that I saw an image operating are aesthetic forms that entail mimesis, patterns, symmetry, and even beauty. And this is of course applicable whether we're talking about a scenario, which is more of a narrative structure, or whether we're talking about 2D or 3D models, which are means of visualization. Models at large are tools of strategic thinking and prediction. There are ways to empiricize and pattern what did not take place, even if they are based on something that already happened. Model simulations and scenarios are designed to and prompted by preparedness, yet they do not draw from the actual. They are a means of optimization, extending the human and into the non-human, what happened to what did not happen, and so on. They serve a society that is driven by risk, speculation, and damage control. And I think actually that the pandemic taught us a lot about models and their kind of like social and political resonance. In their mere technological enabling, but also in their cultural work, models are not empirical tools, but contain cracks through which aspects related to imagination and desire sit in which social fantasies and formations become visible. And actually, I borrowed the title of my presentation today, Maps to the Future, from a citation of Hito Stell, another artist that works a lot with 3D modeling, where she says that the model itself kind of like has this pattern of social constructions embedded in them. With these observations, the model being an aesthetic form and being shaped by social imagination should be stressed, need to be stressed as something that is not empiric as such. The other thing that I also want to stress is that the model is not an operative image, but it's kind of like a blueprint. A sort of preliminary stage. Considering all that, the model is a form of representation. As for the question of the human-machine hybridity, I think the ACE project demonstrates it well. In my work, I draw on sociologist Corinne Knorr-Cetina and her work on what she termed the synthetic situation, a situation that involves the interaction of human and screens in, and I quote, an environment augmented by scope component. And here is the definition that she provides for scope component or scopic systems, and I quote, "An arrangement of hardware, software, and human feats that together function like a scope, like a mechanism of observation and projection, here collecting, argumenting, and transmitting the reality of the markets, their internal environments, and external context." So Knorr-Cetina is working on economic models mostly. And once again, I need to mention that it's kind of uncanny to read her work in this kind of like post-pandemic world. I also think that here there is a wider room to contemplate how we understand human bodies or human actions themselves in an age where human bodies and actions are already transformed by these kind of like high-tech solutions, AI being one of which. So these days it seems that human bodies themselves are sort of a liquid phenomena. They become more and more virtualized and optimized. So from the perspective of it is interesting to note that the kind of like internal terminology of at least AI engineers, the approach to the human body is not as a replacement, but actually as a form of enhancement. So even within this internal terminology of AI engineers, the body is not assumed, like the human body is not assumed as a stable thing that is then in correlation with AI, but actually there is much more liquidity happening between the two entities. As a sort of link between the second and the third aspect, I want to bring two provocations that are, in a way, the two sides of the same thing. Writing about Faruqi's category of the operative image, film scholar Volker Pantenburg wonders if, in an age of machine-readable images, we can still call these manifestations images. Do machine-readable images still conform to the logic of the image, or what we understand as an image? From the other side, and this is something that came up once again in a conversation that I had with an image engineer, AI makes the image redundant, unnecessary. AI needs an algorithm that needs a code, not a surface of representation. So the question is, once again, why do we have these images at all? And here, and I'm taking us back to Faruqi video, I want to suggest that images, ones that follow the logic of representation, that render things visible and allow for intelligent process of contemplation, evaluation, measuring, comparing, and so on, they're important for the operation because an operation is in its more expanded definition, actually always entails representation. And let me articulate that. So first, images are there as the basis for AI training. And we need them because, in a way, AI need to mimic and then suppress human intelligence. So they're like a form of preliminary mediation between AI and the human. Second, images are there as an aftermath, as a trace of an action that took place, a form of accountability in a political system based on representation. So they're there because there are representatives that need to be accountable for their acts. And in that sense, when thinking about a violent conflict, perhaps more than other political projects in contemporary day democracy, a violent conflict demands a lot of mediation. This mediation is needed in order to build social resilience. It's needed in order to mandate certain acts. It's needed in order to, be applicable with the law, or justify to the public the spending of billions of euros or shekels or dollars from the state budget on warfare and so on. So there need to be an accountability, and we see it again and again that images are then being appropriated for this ongoing conversation between the sovereign and citizens about what are these actions and kind of like to justify these actions. which brings me to what is, in a way, the conclusion of the talk, but also for me, the central question in this project. And this is what form of knowledge the operative image allows. And I structure it around the concept of the secret. I will, for the sake of time, I will just like flag some stuff and not really develop them, but we can then talk about them in the Q&A. But before that, I wanted to point your attention to the fact that most of the materials I use today are taken from very public sites, like popular news, some artistic works, and oftentimes also the military and security industries on promotional platforms. So my access to this question is not through what is obscure, but actually what is really out there to be seen and to analyzed. What is out there as a form of display, one can say. My very end contention in relation to the dynamics I described so far is as follows. New technological affordances render more and more operations, in particularly one related to surveillance, targeting, and state-sanctioned killing, virtualized and disassociated from the realm of human action and contemplation. To begin with, these operations are predicated on constructed scenarios and appearances. In their aftermath, these operations draw on image produced by their mechanism as a sort of forensic record, an image which, in which empirical sense is grounded in its being part of an automated process, lacking any human intervention. As purely automated operation, these images also imply a more quote-unquote clean operation, safer for the human operators, allegedly more efficient in its collateral damage, and allegedly more ethical as it relies on mere data and cold considerations. Therefore, what I propose is to critically trace the role of operative images as barriers of trust. So the idea that such images can serve as a record and a gesture of disclosure in space of militarized conflict, where state actions are obscured, so the military imperative secrecy, and are also contested, so the ethical and legal question of the sovereign right to kill. Understanding both images and operations as complex and discursive nexus, I want to problematize the idea that such images are generators of trust between the states and its citizens. And this really ties me to the ConTrust project, and in a way, in the spirit of the cluster, my intervention is a bit polemic. I argue that in contemporary democracies, operative images sustain militarized conflict, so they're like a form of maintenance, as they function as gestures of transparency and at the same time secure a space of obscurity. They teach us, the citizens, to trust by knowing not to know. Which brings me to some reflections on the questions of the secret that I already mentioned is an important part of my project. So why I think that the operative image and the secret are related. So first of all, the secret is there because the kind of operations and image operations I examine are part of what is called the executive state secret. So they're part of these sections in statecraft that are rendered secrecy due to their operation. So as I said, the military imperative of secrecy, or the idea that the state needs this kind of sphere of secrecy in order to operate. Second of all, I understand the secret also in relation to an operation of speculation and what is yet to come. And this is maybe more of a philosophical question, but I mean, we don't really know the future. So the future is a secret, and by kind of like this constructed notion of futureness that AI put forward, in a way, we kind of like, try to claim that we have some knowledge of what is, mostly unknown, therefore a secret. Another aspect of the secret is the secret as expert knowledge. So one needs to know how things work. And when I see operative images kind of like, exposed as these gestures of transparency in the public sphere, it always comes with this kind of like, hint that you don't know what we see, but we know, and that's okay. So there is always this mediation of expert knowledge, and what we trust, obviously, is not the image itself because we cannot read it, but actually a knowledgeable figure that can decipher the image for us. So once again, this realm of obscurity that has to do with knowledge. And lastly, there is this question of the public secret. So the secret as a gesture of exposure and transparency as a governance ideal, especially in contemporary democracies, but in a way, since the operative image, as I just argued, is so much predicated on the unintelligible and the unknown, and what is actually invisible. In a way, this gesture of exposure is an empty gesture. So what it, educates us, the citizens, is basically knowing not to know. So with this list of, propositions or proposal, I would stop here and really looking forward for the discussion and to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Dear Laliv, if I may, thanks a lot. I have to admit that I was not able to follow all of it. It was incredibly intense, and in many things you said, immediately my brain was starting to basically go off on side paths, trying to combine it to areas of my expertise, and then I lost how you had come to something else. So I'm happy that I'm the moderator tonight, so I will have a chance to ask the questions. But as everybody knows, in this round, pretty much is the floor is open to questions from everyone. Please either send me a message in the chat, or as Johannes Völz has already done, raise your hand, and then I'll assign slots for questions. Johannes, would you like to start, please?